If you've ever watched a Western film, you've definitely seen that classic scene. The cowboy stops in a town after a long ride, goes into a saloon and orders a huge plate of meat and beans. The food arrives, steaming, beautiful, plentiful. He eats calmly, takes a sip of whiskey, and continues his journey as if it were nothing. It seems simple. It even looks delicious. Now imagine reality. A man in the middle of nowhere, covered in dust, with his stomach growling for hours, with no town in sight, no saloon, no nothing. What he had to eat was what he carried with him. And what he carried was little, it was bad, and it was often damaged. Food in the Wild West wasn't that pretty scene from the movies. It was a matter of pure survival. Eating was not a pleasure. It was fuel to not die. And today, we're going to open that dish and show you what was really inside it. Because the truth about food in the Wild West is far more disgusting, sadder, and more impressive than any movie has ever shown. To understand what a cowboy ate, you first need to understand where he lived. Or rather, where he didn't live. Because the cowboy wouldn't sit still. He was always on the move, driving cattle hundreds of miles on trips that lasted weeks, sometimes months. There was no house, no kitchen, no table. His world was the trail, the open sky, and the dirt floor. On these trips, called cattle drives, a group of cowboys took hundreds or even thousands of heads of cattle from one point to another. The most famous ranged from Texas to cities like Dodge City or Abilene, Kansas. We are talking about enormous distances, covered at a horse's pace, under the sun, rain, wind, and everything that nature throws at us. And on these journeys, the only thing that stood between the cowboy and complete starvation was a vehicle that became as important as the horse itself, the chuck wagon, the food cart. The chuck wagon was the heart of any cattle party. No era un restaurant sobre rodas. It was a wooden cart, pulled by mules or oxen, equipped with a trunk at the back that functioned as a pantry and preparation bench at the same time. Inside this chest were the basic ingredients, few, simple, and almost always the same. Flour, beans, salted bacon, coffee, sugar, salt, and lard. That was it. This was the basis of practically everything eaten on a cattle trail. There was no variety, no freshness, no choice. The cowboy ate what the cook prepared or did not eat anything. There was no menu, there was no personal preference. Era pagar ou largar. And quitting meant going hungry, so everyone took it. And the chuck wagon cook, called Cookie, was one of the most important figures in the entourage. Not because he was a skilled chef, but because the mood and disposition of everyone else depended on him. A good cookie could transform those miserable ingredients into something that at least filled the belly without causing vomiting. A bad cookie could cause revolt among the cowboys. And that's no exaggeration. There are records of delegations where men almost abandoned work because of the food. Not because it was cool, but because it was so bad that the body refused to swallow it. Cookie woke up long before everyone else, usually around 3 in the morning. He lit the fire in the dark, prepared the coffee, and started cooking, while the rest of the party was still asleep. When the cowboys got up at sunrise, the food had to be ready. There was no delay. A cookie who was late for breakfast was treated with the same contempt as a cowboy who lost a cattle. And after serving the first meal, the cookie dismantled everything, loaded the cart, and went ahead of the group to reach the next stopping point before everyone else, in time to prepare the next meal. It was work without rest, without recognition, and without any glamour. He was the first to wake up and the last to sleep. And even so, he was the most criticized of the entire entourage. Now let's get to what really matters, what was on the plate. A cowboy's breakfast was simple until it hurt. Biscuits, bacon, and coffee. The biscuits were made with flour, lard, and a little yeast, baked in an iron pan covered with hot coals. When they were good, they were soft on the inside and with a golden crust on the outside. When they went bad, and they went bad most of the time, they were hard, dry, and tasteless. They looked like lumps of clay that someone had decided to stick in the fire. But they were what I had, so I ate them without complaining. Some cowboys would dip the biscuit in coffee to soften it. Others broke it up with their hands and mixed it with the bacon grease. Everyone found their own way to make it less painful. Bacon was the cowboy's protection against hunger. But it wasn't the thin, crispy bacon we know today. It was a thick piece of pork, heavily salted to preserve it without refrigeration. There was so much salt that sometimes the bacon needed to be boiled before frying, just to remove the excess. Even so, the taste was still strong, greasy, and after weeks of eating the same thing, it became almost unbearable. But fat was energy, and energy was what kept those men standing. The body needed heavy fuel to last 12, 14 hours on a horse, and bacon provided that. It wasn't tasty, it wasn't healthy, but it was functional. And in the Old West, functional was all that mattered. And the coffee. Old West coffee deserves a separate chapter. It had nothing to do with what we drink today. Coffee was made by throwing ground beans directly into a kettle of boiling water. No filter, no strainer, nothing. The result was a black, thick, bitter liquid, full of sludge at the bottom. The cowboys called him in different ways, and none of them were affectionate. It was strong enough to wake the dead and bitter enough to make anyone frown. Some cookies threw eggshells into the kettle, saying this helped settle the grounds. Others simply didn't care. If the cowboy swallowed sludge with it, that's his problem. But coffee was sacred. It was the first thing you drank in the morning and the last thing at night. It was the minimum comfort in that hard life. A cowboy could accept bad food, he could accept rain, he could accept pain. But bad coffee was a personal insult. A cookie that made weak coffee was despised by the entire entourage. Coffee represented more than a drink. It was a ritual. The only moment of the day where a man held something warm in his hands and could pretend for a few seconds that life wasn't that hard. O almoço, quando existia, era rápido y frio. While driving cattle, there was no time to stop and cook in the middle of the day. The cowboys ate what was left over from breakfast: a piece of cold bacon, a hard biscuit, perhaps a handful of dried beef. They ate in the saddle without dismounting, without stopping. The cattle couldn't stay still, and neither could the cowboy. Any pause meant delay, and delay meant trouble. So the man chewed as he rode, swallowed as he watched the herd, and rode on with a half-empty stomach and a dry mouth. Dried meat, called jerky, was one of the most important foods in the Old West diet. It was meat cut into thin strips, salted and left to dry in the sun or smoke. The drying process could take days, but the result was meat that would last for weeks without spoiling. The problem is that the texture was almost impossible to chew. It was as hard as old leather. Men had to tear off pieces with their teeth and chew for several minutes until they were able to swallow. It tasted of almost nothing, just salt and a vague memory that it had once been fresh meat. But it was protein. And protein was what kept the muscles working in a body that knew no rest. Dinner was the main meal. This was when the procession finally stopped. The horses rested and the men could sit around the fire. And the most common dish, the one that appeared almost every night without exception, was beans. Beans cooked in an iron pan, seasoned with salt, lard, and sometimes a piece of bacon to add flavor. It was simple, it was heavy, it was repetitive to the core, but it filled my belly like nothing else could. Beans were cheap, easy to transport, and lasted a long time dry. All it took was water and fire to turn those hard grains into a hot meal. And a hot meal in the middle of nowhere, with the cold of night approaching, was a luxury these men never underestimated. Along with the beans, the cookie made more cookies, and when he had the ingredients, a dish the cowboys called son of a gun stew. It was a stew made with the parts of the ox that no one else wanted: tongue, heart, liver, brains, intestines, marrow. Everything was cut into pieces, thrown into a large pan, and cooked until it became a thick, dark mixture. The smell was strong. The appearance was not at all inviting, but the taste, according to reports at the time, was surprisingly good, at least when the cookie knew what it was doing. This stew was the most common way to use the meat of cattle that died during the journey or that needed to be slaughtered for some reason. Nothing was wasted. Every part of the animal was used. The bones became broth. The fat became lard for cooking. The leather was used for other purposes. The mentality was clear and non-negotiable. In the West, throwing away food was the worst thing a man could do. It was almost a sin. And when the beans and bacon ran out, when the trip took longer than planned and supplies ran low, then things got really difficult. Cowboys resorted to everything the land had to offer. They hunted when they could. Rabbits, birds, armadillos, even snakes. Yes, snakes. Rattlesnake meat was consumed more frequently than we think. They said the taste reminded them of chicken. If it is the truth or not, it didn't matter. What mattered was having something to put in my mouth and trick my stomach for a few more hours. Wild plants were also on the menu in moments of desperation. Roots, wild fruits when the season permitted, cacti in desert regions. But eating plants in the West was risky. Many species were toxic, and without adequate knowledge, a man could poison himself trying to satisfy his hunger. Some learned from Native Americans which plants were safe. This exchange of knowledge saved many lives, more than any weapon or medicine. Others were not that lucky and learned the hard way possible, spending days with pain, vomiting, and fevers that could be fatal. Water was another constant problem. Finding clean water in the West was almost as difficult as finding gold. Rivers and streams existed, but they were not always nearby, and the water was not always drinkable. Many sources were contaminated by dead animals, cattle feces, or simply invisible bacteria that turned a sip of water into a death sentence. Dysentery and cholera were direct results of contaminated water, and they killed with frightening efficiency. A man could drink water in the morning and be dead by night, and the worst part is that there was no way of knowing before drinking it. The water looked clean, it looked good, but inside it carried something that the eye couldn't see. Cowboys learned that boiling water helped, even though they didn't understand exactly why. They knew nothing about bacteria or microorganisms. They only knew that boiled water caused fewer problems. And coffee, once again, became not just a drink, but a way of purifying water through the heat of boiling. Drinking coffee was, without knowing it, a survival measure. Now it's important to remember that not everyone in the Old West ate the same way. The cowboy on the trail had the worst possible diet, but those who lived in cities had a little more choice. Little, but there was. Saloons served meals, yes, but they weren't restaurants as we know them. The food was basic, expensive by the standards of the time, and not always reliable. A typical saloon dish might include cooked game meat, beans, cornbread, and if the location was reasonable, some vegetables such as potatoes or onions. The quality varied wildly from place to place. Saloon in San Francisco podia servir algo aceitavo. A saloon in the middle of Arizona probably served something that today would have the health authorities shut down any restaurant without a second thought. And there was the problem of conservation. Without a refrigerator, without a freezer, without any modern way of preserving food, the meat that arrived in the cities was already in the process of deteriorating. The smell wasn't always good. The color was not always natural. Sometimes the flesh was already greenish around the edges, with a strange glow that indicated the beginning of decomposition. But the cooks seasoned heavily, adding pepper, salt, vinegar, everything that could disguise the taste and odor of meat that had seen better days. And people ate, because the alternative was not to eat, and not eating meant not having the strength to work, and not working meant dying. In the mining camps, the situation was even worse. The miners worked so much that they barely had time to prepare a decent meal. They ate standing up quickly, whatever was available. Canned sardines, when they were lucky to find them. Hard bread that had been overcooked for days. Dried fruits that cost a small fortune. Food prices in the gold camps were absurd because everything had to be transported long distances to get there. A single egg could cost the equivalent of an entire day's work. An apple was worth almost its weight in gold, literally. And even so, the men paid because hunger did not negotiate a price. And the drink? Well, we already talked about coffee. But the Wild West was driven by something else, too. Whiskey, or at least what they called whiskey. What was served in saloons was rarely real whiskey. It was a cheap mixture of grain alcohol and water, colored with tobacco, molasses, or even gunpowder to give color and strength. The popular name said everything about the quality of it. They called it tarantula juice, tonsil paint, rot gut, coffin varnish, each name worse than the other, and each sip was Russian roulette for the stomach. The burning went down his throat and settled in his chest like an ember. My eyes watered. My breathing stopped for a second, and then there was that heat that spread throughout my body. Men called it relaxing. In fact, it was the body going into shock with what it had just received. Drinking this regularly destroyed the body from within. It burned the stomach, attacked the liver, clouded the mind. But the men drank anyway. After a whole day of brutal work, a glass of that stuff was the only moment of forgetfulness, the only instant where the body stopped hurting and the mind stopped thinking. It was temporary relief with permanent consequences. But in the Wild West, no one thought about long-term consequences, because long-term was a concept that almost didn't exist there. What existed was today, and today the man wanted to drink. One thing the films never show is the effect this terrible diet had on men's bodies. Cowboys suffered from severe dental problems. Without a brush, without toothpaste, without a dentist, the teeth would rot inside the mouth. The pain was constant, throbbing, and never went away. Many people pulled out their own teeth with pliers when the pain became unbearable. No anesthesia, nothing. They grabbed the tooth with a tool, closed their eyes, and pulled. The scream echoed through the camp, and then came relief mixed with the taste of blood in the mouth. It was brutal, but it was the only solution available. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was alarmingly common. The symptoms were horrible. Gums that bled and swelled until they covered the teeth, teeth that fell out on their own without warning, wounds that didn't heal for weeks, a deep tiredness that didn't go away with any rest. The body was slowly deteriorating, and the man became weaker every day without understanding exactly what was happening, all because the diet did not include enough fresh fruits and vegetables. And how would you include it? In the middle of a desert, driving cattle under a 40-degree sun, where would a man find an orange? Intestinal problems were everyday life for practically everyone. Diarrhea, terrible cramps, worms. The combination of contaminated water, poorly preserved meat, and poor hygiene created the perfect environment for parasites to settle in the body and multiply without control. A cowboy lived with intestinal worms as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Because for him, it was normal. It was the life I knew. Never had another. I didn't know it could be different. But even with all this, even with the repetitive food, the dirty water, the spoiled meat, and the bitter coffee, there was a moment of the day that every cowboy looked forward to. Dinner around the campfire. It wasn't about the food itself. It was for the moment. It was the only time of day when men could stop, sit, look at the fire, and simply exist without working. They told stories, laughed at bad jokes, sang out of tune songs that they had learned at home when they still had a house. Some played the harmonica, and the melody mingled with the crackling of embers and the distant lowing of cattle. Others just sat in silence, looking at the flames, thinking about home, thinking about the family left behind, thinking if one day it would all be worth it, if one day they were going to come back, if anyone still remembered them. The food was bad. Everyone knew, but it was hot. And in the middle of that immensity, with the starriest sky you can imagine, a sky that people in cities will never see, a hot meal alongside other men who understood the same suffering, who carried the same pain, who had the same fears that had a value that no restaurant in the world can offer. It was more than food. It was belonging. It was knowing that, at least in that moment, in that circle of light around the fire, no one was alone. Next time you sit down to eat, with fresh food, real seasoning, clean water, and a roof over your head, remember one thing. There was a time, not so long ago, when men crossed continents eating hard beans, salty bacon, and tooth-breaking biscuits, drinking coffee grounds and water that could kill, chewing on dried meat that looked like boot soles. And yet, these men continued. They got on the horse the next day, swallowed another tasteless dish, and moved on. Not because they liked it, not because it was easy, but because giving up was never an option for those men. This was the real Western diet. No glamour, no flavor, no freshness, just enough to keep a man alive for another day, just the minimum for the body to withstand one more journey, one more trail, one more sunrise in the middle of nowhere. And now I ask you, could you last a week eating like a real cowboy? No seasoning, no variety, no complaining? Leave it in the comments.